Standing in that courthouse hallway watching my mother clutch her worn purse with trembling hands, I never imagined I would become the one thing that could destroy my father's empire. He had spent 20 years convincing everyone that Mom was just a simple farm girl who got lucky marrying him. Today she was suing him for half of everything he built during their marriage. When he saw us walk through those doors, his cruel laughter echoed off the marble walls. He had no idea his own daughter had become a lawyer. My name is Bernadette Thompson, and for 28 years I watched my father, Marcus, systematically destroy my mother's spirit. Growing up in our sprawling suburban home outside Chicago, I witnessed something that most people would never believe about the successful businessman who owned Thompson Auto Centers across 3 states. Behind closed doors, Marcus Thompson was a monster who used psychological warfare to control every aspect of my mother, Dorothy's life. Mom came from a small dairy farm in rural Wisconsin. She was 19 when she met my father at a county fair young and trusting with dreams of seeing the world beyond cornfields and cow barns. Marcus was 26, then already ambitious and charming when he wanted to be. He swept her off her feet with promises of a better life marriage proposals under starlit skies and visions of building something magnificent together. What Mom didn't realize was that Marcus saw her as an acquisition, not a partner. From the moment they married, he began his campaign to make her believe she was worthless without him. He would introduce her at business functions as my little country girl who doesn't understand city life. When she offered ideas about customer service or business operations, he would pat her head condescendingly and tell her to leave the thinking to him. The psychological abuse escalated over the years. Marcus convinced Mom that her Wisconsin accent made her sound uneducated, so she stopped speaking up in public. He told her that her family was embarrassing, so she gradually lost touch with her siblings and parents. When she suggested getting a job or pursuing education, he would laugh and ask what employer would want someone with her limited skills. But I knew the truth. Mom was brilliant in ways that Marcus refused to acknowledge. She had an intuitive understanding of people that made customers trust our auto shops. She suggested the satisfaction guarantee program that became our company's signature policy. During the 2008 recession, when other auto shops were failing, Mom proposed the payment plan system that kept us afloat. Marcus implemented every single one of her ideas, then took credit for them publicly, while dismissing her contributions at home. The breaking point came 6 months ago. I was visiting for Sunday dinner when Marcus announced he was filing for divorce. Mom dropped her coffee cup and it shattered across the kitchen floor, like her world was shattering around her. Marcus handed her legal papers and smiled coldly as he explained that she would receive $50,000 in the settlement. $50,000, Mom whispered, her voice barely audible. Be grateful, Marcus replied, straightening his tie. You contributed nothing to this business. Your name isn't on any documents. Legally, you have no claim to what I built with my own hands and intelligence. Mom looked at me with such profound sadness that I felt something break inside my chest. She had spent 23 years supporting a man who now claimed she was worthless. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. What neither of my parents knew was that I had been secretly attending Northwestern University School of Law for the past 3 years. While they believed I worked as a marketing coordinator for a downtown firm, I was actually using my trust fund from Grandma Ruth to pay tuition and living expenses. Every evening after my parents thought I was home relaxing, I was studying case law, constitutional principles, and family court procedures. My motivation was simple but powerful. I had spent my childhood watching my mother's light dim a little more each year. I saw how Marcus's constant belittling made her question her own intelligence and worth. I witnessed her flinch when he raised his voice, saw her apologize for things that weren't her fault, watched her shrink herself smaller and smaller to avoid his criticism. 3 years ago, I decided I would become the weapon Mom needed to fight back. I studied family law with particular focus on hidden asset cases and psychological abuse patterns. I graduated summa cum laude and passed the Illinois bar exam 2 weeks before Marcus filed for divorce. My timing wasn't coincidental. For 6 months, I had been secretly gathering evidence. I hired a private investigator to follow Marcus and document his activities. I obtained copies of business records through legitimate legal channels. I recorded conversations where Marcus admitted things he would never say in court. I was building a case that would expose 23 years of financial manipulation and emotional abuse. Now walking into the Cook County Courthouse on this crisp October morning, I was ready to deploy everything I had learned and discovered. Marcus stood near the defendant's table with his expensive attorney, Hamilton Gray, a silver-haired man in a perfectly tailored suit who charged $800 per hour. Marcus wore his most confident expression, the same smug smile he used when he thought he was outsmarting someone. When he saw Mom and me approaching, his laughter filled the courtroom's high-ceilinged space. "Look at this," he announced loudly enough for everyone to hear. "That stinking country girl thinks she can sue me. Who's she got representing her? The public defender." Hamilton Gray chuckled politely at his client's joke while organizing papers at their table. The court reporter looked up from her machine with mild interest. Mom's hands shook as she gripped her purse tighter, and I could see her fighting the urge to turn around and leave. That's when I stepped forward, my bar certification letter in hand, and approached Judge Patricia Caldwell's bench. "Your Honor," I said clearly, my voice carrying across the silent courtroom, "I'll defend her." Marcus's laughter died in his throat. Hamilton Gray looked up sharply from his documents. Mom turned to stare at me with complete shock and confusion. The court reporter's fingers froze above her keyboard. "And you are?" Judge Caldwell asked, looking at me over her reading glasses. "Bernadette Thompson." "Your Honor, I'm a licensed attorney in the state of Illinois, and I'll be representing Dorothy Thompson in these proceedings." I handed my credentials to the bailiff, who passed them to the judge. The silence in that courtroom was deafening. Marcus's face went through several expressions in rapid succession: confusion, disbelief, anger, and finally something that might have been fear. Mom grabbed my arm and whispered, "Bernadette, what's happening? When did you become a lawyer?" I squeezed her hand gently. "I'll explain everything, Mom, but right now we have a case to win." Judge Patricia Caldwell examined my credentials with the thoroughness of someone who had seen every trick attempted in family court over her 20-year career. She was a stern woman in her mid-60s, with gray hair pulled back in a perfect bun and eyes that seemed to see through any deception. Her reputation for fairness was matched only by her intolerance for games and manipulation. "Mr. Gray," she addressed Marcus's attorney, "did you know that the plaintiff would be represented by family counsel?" Hamilton Gray shifted uncomfortably in his expensive suit. He was known throughout Chicago legal circles as a formidable opponent who specialized in protecting wealthy men's assets during difficult divorces. His track record was impressive, his fees astronomical, and his confidence usually unshakable. Today, however, he looked genuinely surprised. "No, Your Honor. Our understanding was that Mrs. Thompson would be representing herself or seeking court-appointed counsel due to financial limitations." Marcus leaned over to whisper something urgent in Gray's ear, but the judge's voice cut through their conference. "The court recognizes Bernadette Thompson as qualified counsel for the plaintiff. Proceed with your opening statements." I stood at the plaintiff's table feeling the weight of 3 years of secret preparation and 28 years of watching my mother suffer. Mom sat beside me, still stunned by the revelation that her daughter had become an attorney, specifically to help her. Her hands had stopped trembling, and I could see something new in her eyes. Maybe hope, maybe just curiosity about what would happen next. "Your Honor." I began, my voice steady despite the magnitude of what I was about to expose. This case represents far more than a simple divorce proceeding. We will demonstrate that Mr. Marcus Thompson has engaged in a systematic campaign of financial fraud, asset concealment, and psychological manipulation, spanning over 2 decades. Marcus scoffed audibly from the defendant's table. His confidence had returned once the initial shock wore off, and he clearly believed that his inexperienced daughter posed no real threat to his carefully constructed defense. "We will prove," I continued, "that Mrs. Dorothy Thompson contributed significantly to the creation and success of Thompson Auto Centers through her innovative customer service concepts, her initial financial investment, and her ongoing operational insights. We will show that Mr. Thompson has deliberately concealed assets, manipulated financial records, and violated his fiduciary duty to his spouse through a pattern of deceptive practices designed to deprive Mrs. Thompson of her rightful share of marital property." I walked to the evidence table and picked up a thick folder containing 6 months of investigative work. "Your Honor, the defendant has portrayed Mrs. Thompson as a simple woman with no business acumen who contributed nothing to his success. The evidence will reveal a very different story." My first exhibit was a recording I had obtained through completely legal means. Marcus had no idea that his business partner's office phone system automatically recorded all calls for quality assurance purposes, or that I had subpoenaed those records. This is a conversation between Mr. Thompson and his business partner, David Richardson, recorded on March 15, 2022. I played the audio file through the courtroom sound system. Marcus's voice filled the room. "Dave, I'm telling you, if Dorothy hadn't come up with that satisfaction guarantee program, we would have gone under in '08. Every other shop in the district was hemorrhaging customers, but people trusted us because of her idea. She saved our asses." "She's got good instincts," David's voice responded. "You should listen to her more often." "Are you kidding? If word got out that my wife was the brains behind our success, I'd lose all credibility with our investors. They want to deal with a strong businessman, not some guy who takes advice from his country girl wife." The courtroom fell completely silent. Mom's eyes filled with tears, but this time they weren't tears of sadness. Hamilton Gray began shuffling through his papers frantically, clearly realizing that his client had not provided him with complete information about the case. I presented my second exhibit, bank records, showing that Dorothy had inherited $30,000 from her grandfather in 2002 and had given every penny to Marcus to fund the second Thompson Auto Center location. The deposit slip clearly showed her signature and her maiden name, Dorothy Elizabeth Kowalski. Mrs. Thompson's financial contribution was not a gift, I explained to the court. It was an investment in what she believed would be their shared future. Mr. Thompson used these funds to purchase the equipment and initial inventory for the Naperville location, which became their most profitable shop. Marcus whispered something urgent to Hamilton Gray, who stood and requested permission to approach the bench. Judge Caldwell granted the request, and both attorneys joined her for a brief sidebar conversation that I couldn't hear. When we returned to our tables, Gray looked decidedly less confident. My third exhibit was the devastating evidence of hidden assets. I had hired a forensic accountant named Sarah Chen, a specialist in tracing concealed wealth who had worked on several high-profile divorce cases. Her investigation revealed that Marcus had been systematically transferring money to accounts controlled by his brother, Thomas Thompson, who lived in Phoenix. These financial records show transfers totaling $2,700,000 made to accounts belonging to Thomas Thompson between January and September of this year. These transfers began immediately after Mr. Thompson consulted with divorce attorneys about ending his marriage. I displayed the bank routing information on a large screen visible to the entire courtroom. The timing was damning. The first transfer occurred just 3 days after Marcus's initial consultation with Gray about divorce proceedings. Mr. Thompson claimed in his financial disclosure that his total assets amount to approximately $1,400,000. However, our investigation reveals that he has concealed nearly twice that amount through these fraudulent transfers to family members. Marcus's confident smirk had completely disappeared. He kept whispering frantically to Hamilton Gray, who looked increasingly uncomfortable as each piece of evidence revealed the depth of his client's deception. My fourth exhibit was perhaps the most emotionally powerful. I had obtained customer testimonials from the past 15 years that specifically praised Dorothy's customer service innovations. Dozens of letters mentioned her personal attention, her follow-up calls to ensure satisfaction, and her development of the payment plan system that helped families afford necessary auto repairs. These testimonials demonstrate that Mrs. Thompson was not merely present in the business. She was instrumental in creating the customer loyalty that made Thompson Auto Centers profitable. Her innovations in customer relations directly resulted in the repeat business and referrals that sustain the company's growth. I read several testimonials aloud, including one from a single mother who wrote, "Mrs. Thompson set up a payment plan that let me fix my car so I could keep my job. She called me personally to make sure everything was working properly. That kind of caring is why we'll never go anywhere else." By this point, Mom was crying openly, but they were tears of recognition and relief. For the first time in decades, someone was publicly acknowledging her contributions and intelligence. The court reporter had to pause several times to wipe her own eyes. Judge Caldwell called for a 30-minute recess, and as the courtroom cleared, Marcus approached our table with barely contained fury. His face was red, his hands clenched into fists, and his voice shook with rage. "How dare you," he hissed at me. "After everything I've provided for you, this is how you repay me by destroying your own father." I stood to face him directly, no longer the intimidated child who had watched him terrorize our household for years. "You destroyed yourself, Dad. I'm just making sure everyone else sees what Mom and I have known all along." "I'll cut you off completely," he threatened. "Your trust fund, your inheritance, everything. You'll have nothing." "I don't need your money anymore," I replied calmly. "I have something much more valuable, the truth and the education to use it." Mom stood beside me, and for the first time in my memory, she looked Marcus directly in the eyes without flinching. "You can't hurt us anymore, Marcus. Your threats don't work when someone finally stands up to you." Hamilton Gray had overheard our conversation and approached Marcus with urgent concern. "We need to discuss settlement options immediately," he told his client. "The evidence they've presented changes everything about our defense strategy." But Marcus was too angry to listen to reason. His carefully constructed world of lies and manipulation was crumbling, and his response was to attack rather than retreat. "I'll fight this until I'm broke before I give that woman 1 penny more than she deserves." That statement would prove to be one of the biggest mistakes of his life. When court resumed after the recess, I could see that Marcus had used the break to compose himself. His red face had returned to its normal color, his hands were no longer clenched, and he wore the same confident expression he used when negotiating business deals. He clearly believed that the worst of my evidence was behind us and that his experienced attorney could minimize the damage during cross-examination. He was completely wrong. "Your Honor," I continued, "the evidence I've presented so far demonstrates Mr. Thompson's financial fraud and concealment of assets. However, there is another dimension to this case that reveals the true depth of his deception and manipulation." I walked to the evidence table and picked up a folder that I had kept separate from the others. Mom looked at me with curiosity since I hadn't discussed this particular evidence with her during our preparation meetings. Some discoveries were too painful to share in advance. Mr. Thompson's efforts to defraud Mrs. Thompson of her marital assets are part of a larger pattern of deception that includes infidelity, emotional manipulation, and elaborate planning for a new life that deliberately excludes his wife of 23 years. Hamilton Gray immediately stood. "Objection, Your Honor. Character evidence regarding alleged infidelity is not relevant to the financial aspects of this divorce proceeding." Judge Caldwell considered the objection carefully. "I'll allow it if counsel can demonstrate relevance to the asset distribution issues before this court." "Thank you, Your Honor. The relevance will become clear as we examine Mr. Thompson's systematic efforts to transfer marital assets for the benefit of his paramour." I had spent weeks gathering evidence of Marcus's affair with his secretary, Amber Collins. The private investigator I hired, retired police detective Frank Morrison, had documented their relationship with photographs, hotel receipts, and financial records that painted a picture of a man who had been planning his escape from his marriage for over 2 years. Ladies and gentlemen, I address the court. Mr. Thompson has been conducting an affair with Miss Amber Collins, his 24-year-old secretary, for approximately 2 years. However, this is not simply a case of marital infidelity. The evidence shows that Mr. Thompson has been using marital assets to fund this relationship, while simultaneously planning to abandon Mrs. Thompson without adequate financial support. I presented hotel receipts showing that Marcus and Amber had taken trips to Las Vegas, Miami, and the Bahamas, all charged to Thompson Auto Center's business accounts. The receipts were particularly damning because Marcus had told Dorothy that these were solo business trips to explore expansion opportunities. These receipts show expenditures of over $80,000 in the past 18 months for hotel rooms, meals, entertainment, and luxury shopping, all involving Mr. Thompson and Miss Collins, and all charged as business expenses to reduce the company's taxable income. Mom's face went pale as she realized the extent of Marcus's betrayal. She had spent those weekends alone in their house, believing her husband was working hard to build their financial security, while he was actually building a secret life with another woman. But the financial evidence was only the beginning. I had obtained something far more emotionally devastating: recorded phone conversations between Marcus and Amber that revealed the depth of his cruelty and planning. Your Honor, I present Exhibit J, a recorded telephone conversation between Mr. Thompson and Miss Collins from August 23rd of this year. I had obtained this recording legally through a subpoena served on Marcus's phone company, since Illinois is a one-party consent state, and Amber had actually been recording their conversations without Marcus's knowledge. Marcus's voice filled the courtroom, and his confident expression began to falter as he realized what was about to be revealed. "Amber, baby, once I get rid of the country girl, we can live like royalty. I've got almost $3 million stashed away that she knows nothing about. We'll move to Costa Rica, buy that beach house we looked at, and never have to see Chicago winters again." Amber's voice responded, "What if she fights the divorce? What if she gets a lawyer?" Marcus laughed, and the sound made Mom flinch in her chair. "Are you kidding? Dorothy's too scared of her own shadow to fight me. She'll take whatever I offer because she's convinced she can't survive without me. I've spent 23 years making sure she believes she's worthless." The courtroom was completely silent except for the sound of Mom's quiet crying. Even the bailiff looked uncomfortable as Marcus's cruel words echoed off the walls. But the conversation continued, and it got worse. "Plus," Marcus's voice continued, "if she does try to cause problems, I've got a backup plan. I've been documenting what I call her episodes, times when she gets emotional or confused. My lawyer says I could probably have her declared mentally incompetent if necessary. Then I'd get control of her mother's inheritance, too." "How much is that worth?" Amber asked. $200,000. Her mom died last year and left Dorothy everything. If I can prove Dorothy's not mentally stable, I become her guardian and control all her assets. It's perfect. The recording ended, and the silence in the courtroom was deafening. Judge Caldwell's expression had hardened considerably, and even Hamilton Gray looked genuinely shocked by his client's words. Mom was no longer crying quietly. She was sobbing with the kind of pain that comes from discovering that someone you trusted with your life has been systematically planning to destroy you. I reached over to hold her hand, and she gripped mine like it was the only thing keeping her anchored to reality. "This recording," I told the court, "reveals not just adultery, but a calculated plan to emotionally and financially abuse Mrs. Thompson, steal her inheritance, and potentially have her declared incompetent to gain control of assets that belong to her by right." I presented additional evidence showing that Marcus and Amber had already made concrete plans for their new life together. They had applied for residency visas in Costa Rica, opened bank accounts there, and even put a deposit on a beachfront property near Tamarindo. Mr. Thompson and Miss Collins have plane tickets for December 15th, just 3 weeks after this divorce was originally scheduled to be finalized. They plan to disappear immediately after Mr. Thompson successfully defrauded Mrs. Thompson of her marital assets. Hamilton Gray requested another sidebar conference with Judge Caldwell, and this time their discussion lasted several minutes. When they returned to their places, Gray looked like a man who was seriously considering withdrawing from the case entirely. Marcus, meanwhile, had lost all pretense of confidence. His face was white, his hands were shaking, and he kept looking toward the courtroom exits as if calculating whether he could make a run for it. During the next recess, he approached our table again, but this time his demeanor was completely different. Gone was the rage and threats. Now he seemed desperate and panicked. "Bernadette," he said quietly, "we can work this out. We're family. I'll give your mother a fair settlement. 500,000, maybe more. We don't need to air all this dirty laundry in court." I looked at him with the same coldness he had shown Mom for 23 years. "It's too late for that, Dad. You made your choice when you decided to treat Mom like she was worthless. Now everyone gets to see who you really are. Please," he begged, and for the first time in my life I heard genuine fear in Marcus Thompson's voice. "I'll lose everything. The business, my reputation, maybe even my freedom if this goes to criminal court." Mom stood up slowly and faced the man who had controlled and diminished her for more than half her adult life. When she spoke, her voice was steady and strong. "You should have thought about that before you decided I was worthless, Marcus. You should have thought about that before you stole my inheritance. You should have thought about that before you told your girlfriend that I was too stupid to fight back." She paused, and I saw something in her eyes that I had never seen before. Not anger, not sadness, but a quiet strength that came from finally understanding her own worth. "But most of all," she continued, "you should have thought about that before you underestimated the daughter who learned from watching you that sometimes the only way to stop a bully is to hit back harder than they expect." Marcus stared at her in complete shock. This was not the timid, submissive woman he had married and controlled. This was someone entirely new, or perhaps someone who had always been there but had finally found her voice. As we prepared to return to our seats, I realized that something fundamental had shifted in that moment. Mom was no longer the victim in this story. She had become a warrior, and I was proud to be fighting beside her. The afternoon session brought a surprise that no one in the courtroom could have anticipated. As we settled back into our seats after lunch, recess, Hamilton Gray approached Judge Caldwell's bench with an unusual request. "Your Honor, I need to request a private conference regarding a potential conflict of interest that has come to my attention during the recess." Judge Caldwell looked surprised. In her 20 years on the bench, she had seen attorneys withdraw from cases, but rarely in the middle of active proceedings. "Approach the bench, counselors." I joined Gray at the judge's bench, curious about what could have developed during our brief break. The sidebar conversation lasted nearly 10 minutes with Gray, speaking in urgent whispers, and Judge Caldwell asking several pointed questions. When we returned to our tables, Gray looked like a man who had received devastating news. "Your Honor," Gray announced to the courtroom, "I need to request a brief recess to consult with my client regarding new information that has come to my attention." But before Judge Caldwell could respond, Gray did something unprecedented in my limited legal experience. He walked directly to our table and addressed Mom and me directly. "Mrs. Thompson, Miss Thompson, I owe you an apology. Your client has been deliberately misleading me about the facts of this case, and I've unknowingly made representations to this court that I now know to be false." Marcus jumped up from his seat. "Hamilton, what are you doing? You work for me." Gray turned to face his client with an expression of professional disgust that was unmistakable. "Mr. Thompson, you showed me completely different financial documents than what your daughter has presented here today. You convinced me that your wife was attempting frivolous litigation against an honest businessman. You made me complicit in fraud." The courtroom buzzed with murmurs from the few spectators present. This kind of drama was unusual even in contentious divorce proceedings, and everyone could sense that something extraordinary was happening. I've been practicing family law for 32 years. Gray continued addressing the court, and I've built my reputation on honest advocacy for my clients. I cannot and will not continue to represent someone who has deliberately misled me about material facts in an attempt to perpetrate fraud upon this court. Judge Caldwell called for order and asked both attorneys to approach the bench again. This sidebar lasted even longer, and I could see Gray presenting documents to the judge that he had apparently brought with him after lunch. When we returned to our seats, Gray made an announcement that stunned everyone present. Your Honor, with the court's permission, I would like to present evidence that I gathered while preparing Mr. Thompson's defense evidence that I now realize actually supports Mrs. Thompson's claims rather than contradicting them. Marcus looked like he was about to have a heart attack. His face had gone from white to a dangerous shade of red, and he was gripping the edge of the table so hard that his knuckles were white. Gray presented documents showing that Marcus had systematically removed Dorothy's name from business documents over the years without her knowledge or consent. These weren't new removals related to the divorce. They were changes made as far back as 2010, suggesting that Marcus had been planning to cut Dorothy out of the business for over a decade. These documents show that Mrs. Thompson's name was listed as co-owner on the original incorporation papers for Thompson Auto Centers, Gray explained. However, Mr. Thompson filed amended articles of incorporation in 2010, 2014, and 2018, each time reducing Mrs. Thompson's ownership percentage until she was eventually listed as having no ownership interest at all. The most damning evidence was a series of documents that showed Marcus had forged Dorothy's signature on several of these filings. Gray had hired a handwriting expert as part of his defense preparation, intending to challenge any documents that Dorothy might present. Instead, the expert's analysis proved that Dorothy's signatures on the amended incorporation papers were forgeries. Mr. Thompson provided me with what he claimed were Mrs. Thompson's signatures authorizing these changes. The handwriting analysis I commissioned proves that these signatures were forged. Mrs. Thompson never consented to having her ownership interest removed from the business. Mom sat in stunned silence as the full scope of Marcus's deception became clear. He hadn't just hidden assets during the divorce proceedings. He had been systematically stealing her legal ownership of the business for over a decade. But Gray wasn't finished with his revelations. Your Honor, there's more. During my investigation, I discovered that Mr. Thompson has been embezzling from his own business partners. He convinced me that he needed to move money to protect assets from what he called his wife's frivolous lawsuit. In reality, he was stealing from the pension funds and profit-sharing accounts of his employees and business partners. Gray presented evidence showing that Marcus had been skimming money from employee retirement accounts and using it to fund his lifestyle with Amber. The amounts were staggering, over $400,000 stolen from people who trusted him with their financial security. These are hard-working mechanics, service advisors, and office staff who believed their boss was looking out for their futures. Instead, he was stealing their retirement savings to pay for luxury vacations with his mistress. The emotional impact of this revelation was devastating. Mom had worked alongside these employees for years, considering many of them friends. Learning that Marcus had stolen from them while they trusted him felt like a personal betrayal of everyone who had been part of the Thompson Auto Centers family. Judge Caldwell called for another recess, and during the break, something unprecedented happened. Gray approached our table with a proposal that seemed almost too good to believe. Miss Thompson, he said, I want to offer my services to help prosecute this case. I've spent 6 months gathering evidence that I thought would help your father, but now I realize it actually proves your mother's case beyond any doubt. I looked at Gray suspiciously. After 3 years of law school and 6 months of preparation, I was naturally skeptical of sudden reversals and unexpected allies. What's in it for you? I asked directly. Gray's answer surprised me with its honesty. Professional survival. If I continue to represent a client who has lied to me this extensively, I could face disciplinary action from the state bar. More importantly, I could face criminal charges if prosecutors decide that I was complicit in his fraud. I need to distance myself from this case immediately, and the best way to do that is to help expose the truth. He presented me with copies of all the evidence he had gathered, including financial records that I hadn't been able to obtain through my own investigation, bank statements, business documents, employee records, everything needed to prove that Marcus had been running a criminal enterprise disguised as a legitimate business. "Your mother deserves more than half of the marital assets," Gray told me quietly. "She deserves punitive damages for fraud, and your father deserves criminal prosecution for theft and embezzlement." As we prepared to return to court for the afternoon session, I realized that our case had evolved far beyond a simple divorce proceeding. We were now looking at potential criminal charges, massive financial settlements, and the complete destruction of Marcus Thompson's carefully constructed empire. Marcus sat alone at the defendant's table, having been abandoned by his attorney and facing the collapse of everything he had built through lies and manipulation. For the first time in my life, I felt genuinely sorry for him. Not because he didn't deserve what was happening, but because he had done it all to himself. Mom squeezed my hand as we took our seats. "I never wanted to destroy him," she whispered. "I just wanted him to treat me like I mattered." "You do matter, Mom," I replied, "and now everyone will know it." The afternoon testimony would prove just how much damage one man could do when he believed no one was strong enough to stop him. The afternoon session resumed with Hamilton Gray formally requesting to withdraw as Marcus's counsel, leaving my father to represent himself or seek new legal representation. Judge Caldwell granted Gray's motion and asked Marcus if he wanted time to find another attorney. Marcus, however, had reached a point of desperate stubbornness. "I can represent myself, Your Honor. I know my business better than any lawyer." It was a decision that would prove catastrophic for him. I stood to present what I knew would be the most damaging evidence yet, information that even Gray hadn't known about during his investigation. My private investigator had uncovered criminal activity that extended far beyond hiding assets from Dorothy. "Your Honor, our investigation has revealed that Mr. Thompson's financial crimes extend throughout his business empire and affect dozens of innocent victims who trusted him with their livelihoods and investments." I presented evidence showing that Marcus had been systematically defrauding his business partners for years. Thompson Auto Centers was actually a partnership with 3 other investors: David Richardson, who owned 2 locations in Indiana, Patricia Santos, who had invested in the original Chicago location, and Robert Chen, who had provided the capital for the parts supply operation. Mr. Thompson has been submitting false financial reports to his partners, claiming lower profits than the business actually generated and keeping the difference for himself. Over the past 5 years, he has stolen approximately $1.2 million that should have been distributed to his partners according to their ownership agreements. I showed the court 2 sets of books, the real financial records showing actual profits and the doctored versions that Marcus provided to his partners. The difference was staggering, and it explained how he had been able to afford his lavish lifestyle while claiming to his partners that the business was barely profitable. But the most shocking revelation concerned Dorothy's family. I had discovered that Marcus had convinced Dorothy's elderly father, Stanley Kowalski, to invest his farm's retirement savings into Thompson Auto Centers in 2015. Stanley had mortgaged his family's dairy farm to provide $60,000 in capital for expansion, with Marcus promising guaranteed returns of 15% annually. Mr. Thompson took Mr. Kowalski's $60,000 and used it for personal expenses rather than business investment. He never paid any of the promised returns, and when Mr. Kowalski faced foreclosure on his farm in 2018, Mr. Thompson told the family that the business investment had failed due to market conditions. Mom gasped audibly when she learned this information. She had never known that her father had invested in Marcus's business, and she certainly didn't know that Marcus had stolen the money and lied about the results. Her family had lost their generational farm partly because of her husband's theft. Mrs. Thompson's father lost his farm and had to move into subsidized housing at age 74 because he believed he was helping his son-in-law build a legitimate business. Instead, his investment money was spent on luxury vacations and expensive gifts for Mr. Thompson's mistress. I presented hotel receipts and jewelry purchase records showing that Marcus had spent Stanley's $60,000 on his affair with Amber within 6 months of receiving the investment. While Dorothy's father was struggling to save his farm, Marcus was buying diamond earrings for his secretary. The evidence pile continued to grow as I revealed Marcus's tax fraud schemes. He had been underreporting income to the IRS while simultaneously overreporting income to banks when applying for loans. This double fraud system had allowed him to avoid taxes while obtaining credit based on false financial information. The Internal Revenue Service has no record of Mr. Thompson paying taxes on approximately $800,000 in income over the past 3 years. He owes the federal government an estimated $240,000 in back taxes, plus penalties and interest that could double that amount. Judge Caldwell looked increasingly stern as each new revelation painted Marcus as a career criminal rather than a successful businessman. The scope of his fraud was breathtaking in its audacity and cruelty. But I saved the most emotionally devastating evidence for last. I had obtained documentation showing that Marcus had been planning to have Dorothy committed to a psychiatric facility to gain control of her inheritance from her mother. Your Honor, we have evidence that Mr. Thompson has been consulting with a private psychiatric facility about having Mrs. Thompson involuntarily committed for what he described as increasing mental instability and inability to manage her finances. I presented emails between Marcus and Dr. Richard Hawkins, director of a private psychiatric hospital outside the city. Marcus had been discussing the process for having Dorothy declared incompetent and gaining legal guardianship over her assets. These communications show that Mr. Thompson planned to use Mrs. Thompson's emotional reactions to his psychological abuse as evidence of mental illness. He documented what he called her episodes, times when she cried or became upset after he berated her, and presented these normal human responses as signs of psychiatric disorder. The emails were chilling in their calculated cruelty. Marcus had written to Dr. Hawkins, "My wife has become increasingly unstable since her mother's death. She cries frequently, has trouble making decisions, and seems confused about financial matters. I'm concerned for her safety and believe professional evaluation is necessary." What Marcus didn't mention in his emails was that Dorothy's confusion about financial matters was actually her growing awareness that money was missing from accounts she had access to, and her emotional instability was the result of years of gaslighting and psychological manipulation. Mr. Thompson's plan was to have Mrs. Thompson committed immediately after their divorce was finalized, then petition the court for guardianship over her inheritance from her deceased mother. This would have given him control over an additional $200,000 while leaving Mrs. Thompson institutionalized and unable to defend herself. Mom was no longer crying. She sat in stunned silence, processing the full scope of the man she had been married to for 23 years. This wasn't just financial abuse or even infidelity. This was a calculated plan to destroy her completely and steal everything she had left in the world. Marcus had been sitting silently during my presentation, but at this point he jumped to his feet. "This is all lies," he shouted. "She's making this up to turn you against me." Judge Caldwell fixed him with a stare that could have melted steel. "Mr. Thompson, you will sit down and remain silent unless I address you directly. Your outburst is noted for the record." I concluded my evidence presentation with the most recent discovery. Marcus and Amber had accelerated their timeline for leaving the country. Their original plan was to depart after the divorce was final, but recent credit card records showed they had purchased new plane tickets for this coming weekend. Your Honor, we believe Mr. Thompson is a flight risk. He has plane tickets for Costa Rica departing in 4 days. He has established residency and banking relationships there, and he has the means to disappear permanently with stolen assets. Judge Caldwell immediately ordered the bailiff to collect Marcus's passport and issued a temporary restraining order, preventing him from leaving Cook County without court permission. Marcus watched in horror as his escape plan crumbled before his eyes. During the final recess of the day, Marcus approached our table one last time. Gone was any pretense of confidence or authority. He looked like a broken man who finally understood that his decades of manipulation and fraud had caught up with him. "Dorothy," he said quietly, "I never meant for things to go this far. I love you. I always have." Mom looked at him with an expression I had never seen before. Not hatred, not fear, but a kind of sad clarity that comes from finally seeing someone exactly as they are. "No, Marcus," she replied softly. "You loved what I could do for you. You loved having someone you could control, but you never loved me because you never bothered to know who I really was." She stood up and faced him directly. "I spent 23 years trying to be the woman you wanted me to be. I made myself smaller, quieter, less intelligent, less capable, because I thought that's what love meant. But love doesn't require you to disappear." Marcus reached out as if to touch her arm, but she stepped back. "Don't. We're done, Marcus. We've been done for years. I just finally have someone who helped me see it." As court adjourned for the day, I realized that we had moved far beyond winning a divorce case. We had exposed a criminal enterprise that had harmed dozens of people and revealed the true character of a man who had fooled an entire community for decades. Tomorrow would bring the final confrontation, and I was ready to finish what we had started. The next morning brought an unexpected development that would turn our already dramatic case into something resembling a legal thriller. As Mom and I arrived at the courthouse, we found Hamilton Gray waiting for us in the hallway with a young woman I didn't recognize. "Miss Thompson, Mrs. Thompson." Gray approached us with obvious urgency. "I'd like you to meet someone who contacted my office last night after news of yesterday's proceedings reached her." The young woman stepped forward, and I immediately recognized her from the surveillance photos my private investigator had taken. This was Amber Collins, Marcus's secretary and mistress, the woman whose affair with my father had been exposed in court just 24 hours earlier. Amber was prettier in person than in the photographs, with shoulder-length blonde hair and blue eyes that would have been striking if they weren't red from crying. She wore a conservative navy dress and carried a briefcase accompanied by her own attorney, a sharp-looking woman in her 40s. "Mrs. Thompson." Amber said, her voice shaking slightly. "I know you have no reason to listen to me, but I need to tell you something important about your husband, about what he's been planning." Mom studied Amber's face carefully. After 23 years of marriage to a master manipulator, she had developed good instincts for detecting deception. Whatever she saw in Amber's expression seemed to satisfy her. "What do you want to tell me?" Mom asked simply. Amber's attorney, who introduced herself as Jennifer Walsh, spoke first. "My client has information that could be crucial to your case, Mrs. Thompson. In exchange for her testimony, she's seeking immunity from any criminal charges that might result from her involvement with Mr. Thompson's financial schemes." I looked at Walsh skeptically. "What kind of involvement are we talking about?" Miss Collins was unaware of the extent of Mr. Thompson's fraudulent activities, Walsh explained. However, she did assist with some financial transactions that she now realizes were part of his scheme to hide assets from you. She's willing to testify about everything she knows if she can receive protection from prosecution. Judge Caldwell agreed to hear Amber's testimony in camera, privately in her chambers, to determine its relevance before presenting it to the full court. What we learned during that session was more damaging to Marcus than anything we had presented so far. Amber revealed that Marcus had been systematically manipulating her, just as he had manipulated Dorothy. He had convinced her that Dorothy was mentally unstable and trying to steal money that rightfully belonged to him. He showed her forged medical records suggesting that Dorothy was suffering from early-onset dementia and needed to be institutionalized for her own safety. He told me that Dorothy was dangerous. Amber testified, tears streaming down her face. He said she had threatened to hurt herself and me if she found out about our relationship. He made me believe that everything we were doing was to protect her from her own mental illness. Amber described how Marcus had her forge Dorothy's signature on documents, telling her that Dorothy was too confused to sign them herself, but had given permission for Amber to handle her financial affairs. She had unknowingly helped Marcus steal over $300,000 from accounts that legally belonged to Dorothy. "I thought I was helping a man protect his sick wife," Amber sobbed. "I never realized I was helping him steal from her." But Amber's most devastating testimony concerned Marcus's future plans. She revealed that he had been threatening her for weeks, saying that if their scheme was discovered, he would claim that everything was her idea and that she had seduced him into helping her steal from his innocent wife. He told me that if anything went wrong, he would say I manipulated him into the affair and convinced him to hide money from Dorothy. He said no one would believe a young secretary over a respected businessman and that I would go to prison while he played the victim. Amber had been recording their conversations for weeks, terrified that Marcus would follow through on his threats to destroy her if their crimes were exposed. She presented over 40 hours of recorded conversations that revealed the true scope of Marcus's manipulation and planning. One recording was particularly damning. In it, Marcus discussed his plan to have Dorothy committed and Amber arrested, leaving him free to disappear with all the money they had stolen. "Once I get rid of both of them, I'll have about $4 million and a clean slate," Marcus's voice said clearly. "Dorothy will be locked up in a psychiatric hospital. Amber will be in prison for fraud, and I'll be living on a beach in Costa Rica with no extradition treaty." Judge Caldwell listened to several of these recordings and agreed that Amber's testimony would be crucial for the court proceedings. She granted Amber immunity in exchange for her complete cooperation and truthful testimony. When court resumed, Amber took the witness stand and repeated her testimony for the official record. The impact on Marcus was immediate and devastating. His carefully constructed image as a successful businessman, destroyed by a mentally unstable wife and manipulative mistress, crumbled completely. Marcus's attempts to cross-examine Amber without an attorney were pathetic and desperate. He accused her of lying, claimed she had threatened him, and even suggested that she and I had conspired together to frame him. Each accusation made him look more unhinged and desperate. "Miss Collins," Marcus said during his cross-examination, "didn't you threaten to ruin my life if I didn't leave my wife for you?" Amber looked at him with a mixture of pity and disgust. "No, Mr. Thompson. You told me that your wife was mentally ill and that you were planning to divorce her to protect both of us from her dangerous behavior. You convinced me that hiding money was necessary to keep her from hurting herself or others." Or, "That's not true," Marcus shouted. "You seduced me. You convinced me to betray my family." Judge Caldwell intervened sharply. "Mr. Thompson, you will control yourself in my courtroom. Continue with proper questioning or sit down." But Marcus was beyond rational thought. 24 hours of watching his empire crumble had pushed him to a breaking point, and he began ranting about conspiracies and lies, claiming that everyone in the courtroom was working against him. "This is all planned," he yelled. "My own daughter, my secretary, even my attorney. You're all working together to destroy me. Dorothy's not smart enough to plan something like this." That statement proved to be his final mistake. Mom stood up slowly from her seat and faced the man who had spent 23 years telling her she wasn't smart enough to understand her own life. "You're right about one thing, Marcus," she said clearly, her voice carrying throughout the silent courtroom. "I wasn't smart enough to plan this. I wasn't smart enough to see through your lies for over 20 years. I wasn't smart enough to realize that someone who claimed to love me would steal from my family and plan to have me locked away like a criminal." She walked closer to the witness area where Marcus stood, and for the first time in their marriage, he actually stepped backward as she approached. "But I was smart enough to raise a daughter who saw exactly who you were. I was smart enough to contribute ideas that made your business successful even when you took credit for them. And I was smart enough to survive 23 years of psychological torture without losing my capacity to trust people who actually deserved it. Mom turned to address Judge Caldwell directly. Your Honor, I don't want to destroy this man, even though he tried to destroy me. I want justice for myself and for all the other people he's hurt. But mostly, I want to make sure he can never do this to anyone else. The courtroom remained silent as Mom returned to her seat. Marcus stared after her with an expression of complete shock, as if he was seeing her for the first time in their marriage. Judge Caldwell called for a brief recess to review the evidence and prepare her ruling. As the courtroom cleared, Marcus sat alone at the defendant's table, finally understanding that the woman he had underestimated for decades had found her voice and her strength. Tomorrow would bring the final judgment, but the real victory had already been won. Dorothy Thompson was no longer the scared farm girl who had believed she was worthless. She'd become a woman who knew her own value and was willing to fight for it. Judge Patricia Caldwell had seen thousands of divorce cases during her 20 years on the bench, but as she prepared to deliver her ruling in Thompson versus Thompson, she knew this case would be remembered as one of the most complex and emotionally charged proceedings of her career. After careful consideration of all evidence presented, Judge Caldwell began her voice carrying the authority of 2 decades in family court. This court finds that Mr. Marcus Thompson has engaged in systematic fraud, asset concealment, psychological manipulation, and criminal misconduct spanning more than 2 decades of marriage. Marcus sat alone at the defendant's table, having been unable to find an attorney willing to take his case on such short notice. His confident demeanor had completely disappeared, replaced by the hollow expression of a man who finally understood the consequences of his actions. The evidence clearly demonstrates that Mrs. Dorothy Thompson contributed significantly to the creation and success of Thompson Auto Centers through her innovative customer service concepts, her initial financial investment of $30,000, and her ongoing operational insights that were consistently implemented without acknowledgement or compensation. Judge Caldwell's ruling was comprehensive and devastating to Marcus's claims. She awarded Dorothy 68% of all marital assets totaling approximately $4,200,000. The higher percentage was justified as punitive damages for Marcus's fraudulent attempts to hide and steal marital property. Mrs. Thompson will receive full ownership of the Chicago and Naperville Thompson Auto Center locations, the family residence on Maple Street, all joint retirement accounts, and the classic car collection that Mr. Thompson attempted to conceal through transfer to his brother's name. The financial judgment was only the beginning. Judge Caldwell ordered a complete forensic accounting of Thompson Auto Centers, going back 10 years with particular attention to the money stolen from business partners and employees. Marcus would be required to make full restitution to everyone he had defrauded. Mr. Thompson will pay Mrs. Thompson's legal fees in the amount of $47,000. He will also provide additional compensation of $300,000 for emotional distress caused by systematic psychological abuse and deliberate attempts to isolate Mrs. Thompson from her family and support systems. Judge Caldwell's most severe order concerned Marcus's attempted theft of Dorothy's inheritance. Mr. Thompson will immediately return all funds taken from Mrs. Thompson's inheritance accounts, plus interest calculated at 12% annually. Any attempt to access or interfere with Mrs. Thompson's inheritance will result in immediate contempt of court charges. The criminal referrals were equally comprehensive. Judge Caldwell formally referred the case to the Cook County State's Attorney for Prosecution on charges of fraud, embezzlement, tax evasion, and conspiracy. The evidence presented in divorce court provided a roadmap for criminal prosecutors to follow. The Internal Revenue Service will be provided with complete financial records documenting Mr. Thompson's systematic tax evasion. The court estimates that Mr. Thompson owes approximately $400,000 in back taxes, penalties, and interest to federal and state authorities. Marcus watched his empire disintegrate with each word of the judge's ruling. Thompson Auto Centers would be sold to pay restitution to defrauded partners and employees. His personal assets would be liquidated to cover tax obligations and court-ordered payments. Even his relationship with Amber had collapsed. She had returned to her home state of Ohio immediately after her testimony, wanting no further involvement in the legal proceedings. But the emotional resolution was far more important than the financial calculations. As Judge Caldwell concluded her ruling, Dorothy stood to address the court one final time. "Your Honor, 23 years ago, I married a man I thought would be my partner in building a life together. I believed that love meant supporting someone unconditionally, even when they made me feel small and worthless. I confused submission with devotion and silence with loyalty." Dorothy's voice was steady and strong, transformed from the trembling woman who had entered the courtroom just days earlier. "This case has taught me that real love doesn't require you to disappear. It doesn't ask you to question your own intelligence or value. Real love celebrates your contributions and encourages your growth." She looked directly at Marcus, and for a moment I saw a flicker of the sadness she felt for the man he could have been. "I forgive you, Marcus, not because you deserve it, but because I deserve to be free from the anger and bitterness that would poison the rest of my life. But forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, and it doesn't mean allowing you to hurt other people the way you hurt me." Dorothy announced her intention to use part of her settlement to establish a legal aid clinic specializing in cases involving financial abuse and psychological manipulation. Too many women stay in destructive relationships because they believe they can't survive on their own or can't afford legal representation. I want to make sure other women have the support I was lucky enough to receive from my daughter. The courtroom erupted in spontaneous applause from the spectators who had gathered to watch the conclusion of the dramatic case. Even the court reporter and bailiff were visibly moved by Dorothy's transformation and her commitment to helping others. 6 months later, the Dorothy Thompson Legal Aid Clinic opened in a renovated building near downtown Chicago. I left my position at a large corporate firm to become the clinic's director, specializing in family law cases involving financial fraud and emotional abuse. Our first client was Patricia Santos, one of Marcus's former business partners, who needed help recovering money he had stolen from her investment account. Marcus pled guilty to multiple felony charges and was sentenced to 7 years in federal prison. He was also ordered to pay restitution totaling over $2 million to his victims. The Thompson Auto Center empire was dissolved, with the proceeds distributed to employees, partners, and creditors who had been defrauded over the years. Dorothy's transformation continued long after the court case ended. She enrolled in business classes at a community college, reconnected with her siblings in Wisconsin, and began dating a retired teacher she met at a support group for abuse survivors. She bought a small house near Lake Michigan and filled it with plants, books, and artwork, things Marcus had never allowed because he claimed they made the house look cluttered and unprofessional. 1 year after our victory in court, Dorothy and I were having dinner at a restaurant overlooking the lake when she asked me a question that surprised me. "Do you ever regret spending those 3 years in law school instead of living your own life? Do you ever wish you had just moved away and left me to figure things out on my own?" I thought about her question carefully before answering. "Mom, those 3 years weren't time stolen from my life. They were an investment in justice, not just for you, but for everyone who doesn't have the resources or support to fight back against people who abuse their power." She smiled and reached across the table to take my hand. "You know, for years I thought love meant sacrifice. I thought it meant making yourself smaller so someone else could feel bigger. But watching you fight for me taught me that real love means making each other stronger." The evening light reflected off the water as we talked about our plans for the clinic, her classes, and the new normal we had created together. We had both learned that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to let someone you care about continue believing lies about themselves. As we walked back to our cars, Dorothy stopped and looked out over the lake. "You know what the strangest thing is? I'm happier now at 44 than I ever was in 23 years of marriage. I spent so long thinking I needed someone else to validate my worth that I forgot I had the power to validate it myself." That night, driving home through the city where we had both been reborn, I reflected on the lesson our story taught. Love isn't about finding someone who completes you. It's about becoming complete enough to love someone without losing yourself in the process. Sometimes the greatest act of love is teaching someone to fight for themselves. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is show someone that they deserve to be treated with respect and dignity. And sometimes the most important victory isn't defeating your opponent. It's helping someone discover their own strength. Our courtroom battle was never really about money or assets or even justice in the traditional sense. It was about reclaiming a voice that had been silenced, restoring a dignity that had been stolen, and proving that no one has the right to make another person feel worthless. Dorothy Thompson walked into that courthouse believing she was just a country girl who had gotten lucky. She walked out knowing she was a strong, intelligent woman who had survived and thrived despite years of systematic abuse. That transformation was worth more than any financial settlement could ever be. Have you ever had to find the courage to stand up to someone who made you feel powerless? Sometimes the people we love most are the ones who need us to be strongest. Share your story in the comments below. Your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. If this story resonated with you, please like this video and subscribe for more true stories about finding strength in unexpected places. And don't forget to share this with someone who might need to remember their own worth. Thank you for listening, and remember, you are stronger than you know, braver than you feel, and more valuable than anyone has the right to tell you otherwise.